It began as any ordinary evening, one of those calm, almost tender endings to a long school day when the world feels safe and familiar. The sun had already begun its quiet descent, tinting the sky in shades of rose and amber, and the air carried that gentle chill that comes just before dusk settles completely. She walked with a lightness in her step, her backpack swinging behind her, her thoughts far away from anything resembling fear. It was the same road she took every day, lined with the same houses, the same trees that whispered softly as the wind passed through their leaves, and the same flickering streetlight that always seemed to struggle to stay awake. Everything about that evening said she was safe, that nothing could possibly go wrong. Sometimes that's the danger in familiarity. It dulls our senses, lulls us into believing that because something has always been safe, it always will be. She believed that too. Maybe we all do. We walk through our routines, as though the world owes us protection, as though darkness will always respect the boundaries we've built around our comfort. She didn't hurry. She didn't look behind her. She didn't sense the quiet stirring that would soon unravel everything she knew. Her footsteps echoed softly against the pavement, a rhythm she'd never noticed before, almost like a heartbeat, steady, calm, alive. The street was nearly empty now. Most of the other students had already gone home, their laughter fading into distant echoes. She glanced at her phone once, scrolling through a few messages, humming faintly to the music that played through her earphones. There was no rush. Her mother would be waiting, dinner nearly ready, lights glowing warmly through the window. That was what she imagined as she walked, the simple comfort of home at the end of a long day. But the thing about safety is that it can shatter in an instant, and when it does, it's never loud at first. It begins with something so small, so subtle, you almost miss it entirely. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted, colder than it should have been, or maybe it was how the streetlight above her flickered, just once, dimming long enough for the shadows to grow deeper. She didn't notice, not yet. She just kept walking, unaware that the world around her was quietly changing. Every story has a moment, an invisible line that separates before and after. She was still in the before, still smiling faintly, still lost in thought. Her shoes scuffed lightly against the concrete, her breath visible in the cooling air. And then a sound, soft, barely there. Another set of footsteps, not close, not loud, but timed perfectly with hers. So perfect, in fact, that it took her several seconds to realize they didn't belong to her. She slowed, the sound slowed too. She stopped. Silence, the kind of silence that hums, that holds its breath with you. She looked over her shoulder, half expecting to see a friend, or a neighbor, or maybe even nothing at all. And that's exactly what she saw. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of road behind her, the long shadows cast by the dim streetlights, and the quiet whisper of wind through the trees. She exhaled, laughed a little under her breath, told herself she was being silly, and began walking again. But now, something in her had shifted. The road she'd known so well suddenly felt longer. The space between one streetlight and the next seemed to stretch endlessly. She adjusted her backpack strap, her pace quickening slightly, though she told herself it was only because she didn't want to be late. Still, her heart began to beat faster, not out of panic, no, not yet, but from that small seed of unease that plants itself when logic no longer feels enough. You know, fear is strange that way. It doesn't always roar into your chest. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, like fog, wrapping itself around your mind until every sound feels sharper, every shadow deeper. She tried to shake it off, turned up the volume of her music, focused on the song, on the familiar lyrics, but even the melody couldn't drown out the rhythm of those footsteps that came again, soft, deliberate, perfectly spaced with her own. She didn't run, not yet, because it's hard to run from what you can't see. It's hard to justify panic when reason tells you you're being paranoid. So she kept walking, faster this time, her fingers tightening around her phone. The houses on either side of the street seemed to watch her, their windows like eyes, glowing faintly, distant, indifferent. The sky had turned darker now, the last traces of daylight bleeding into a heavy blue. At one corner she paused beneath a lamppost. The light above her flickered again, that same irregular pulse she'd seen before. And in that brief moment of darkness, she thought she saw something at the edge of her vision. A movement, a shape, something not quite human, not quite shadow. But when the light steadied, there was nothing there, just an empty road. She laughed again, but it didn't sound like laughter this time. It sounded thin, uncertain. There's something about moments like this that remind us how fragile we really are. One minute, we're surrounded by everything familiar, and the next, we're swallowed by a fear that feels older than words. She began to walk again, each step more hesitant than the last. Her pace matched the pounding of her heart now, quick, uneven. She wanted to look back again, but some quiet instinct told her not to, that if she turned around she might actually see what she was afraid of. So she didn't. She just kept moving forward, her eyes fixed on the faint glow of her house at the end of the street. It was close now, so close she could almost taste relief. And yet, that same sound, the one that followed her, grew clearer, closer. She began to breathe faster, her mind trying to make sense of what her body already knew. She wasn't alone anymore. The street seemed longer than it ever had. Every step felt heavier. The quiet that had once been peaceful now pressed against her like something alive, something watching. And though she couldn't see it, she could feel it. The weight of eyes on her back, the presence that moved when she moved, stopped when she stopped. That was the moment the illusion of safety finally broke. All the ordinary pieces of her world, the familiar street, the glowing lights, the promise of home, collapsed under the realization that something had changed forever. And that's how it always begins. Not with a scream, not with chaos, but with the quietest sound. A second pair of footsteps in the dark. That was the last evening she ever walked home alone. There comes a moment so subtle that it nearly slips by unnoticed, when the air around you changes. You can't quite explain it, but you feel it deep inside, a quiet awareness that something is wrong, though you can't yet say what it is. That's what happened to her. One second she was just walking home, as she always did, and the next the world around her seemed to shift ever so slightly. The night air, once calm and crisp, turned heavier, like the atmosphere itself was watching her. The silence grew thicker, stretching across the street like a blanket that muffled even the faintest sound. And that's when she felt it for the first time, that uneasy silence that didn't feel empty, but full of something waiting. She slowed her steps, sensing the change but not quite ready to believe it. The human mind, you see, is quick to explain away fear. We tell ourselves it's just the wind, or the hum of the city, or maybe our own imagination running wild. But fear, real fear, doesn't come from nowhere. It whispers before it screams. And that whisper had just begun to reach her. She didn't stop walking, she couldn't, not yet, but her movements became slower, more careful. Her eyes scanned the familiar surroundings, searching for something, anything, that could reassure her that she was just overthinking. But the street looked different now. The corners seemed darker, the shadows stretched longer than they should, and even the trees, still and silent, seemed to lean in as if listening. She tried to shake it off. She told herself that maybe the cold was just getting to her. She rubbed her arms, adjusted her backpack, and forced a nervous laugh. Yet deep inside she knew something had changed. The air carried a strange weight now, a thickness that clung to her, that pressed against her skin. Even the streetlights ahead flickered in quiet unison, as if warning her of something unseen. When she looked down the road, she noticed how the street narrowed into darkness, how every pool of light from one lamppost barely reached the next. She'd walked this path countless times, but that evening it felt like walking into the unknown. And then she heard it again, the sound that had unsettled her before, soft, barely audible. But there, footsteps, slow, careful, echoing from her own. Her body stiffened. She stopped walking for a moment, her heart thudding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The sound stopped too. The kind of silence that followed was almost alive. She turned her head slightly, trying to look behind her without being too obvious, but all she could see was the empty stretch of road, illuminated by the dim flickering light. She swallowed hard. Maybe it was nothing, she thought. Maybe the sound had come from a stray cat or someone walking on a side street. She wanted to believe that, she really did. But belief and instinct rarely agree when danger begins to whisper. She forced herself to keep walking, one step at a time. The sound returned, a soft, dragging step that matched hers too perfectly to be coincidence. Every time her shoe met the ground, another sound followed, slightly delayed, deliberate. Not the echo of her own footsteps, but someone, or something, keeping pace with her. It's a strange feeling, that moment when you realize you're not alone. It's not just fear, it's awareness in its purest form. Every nerve awakens, every sense sharpens. She began to notice everything. The rustling leaves, the far-off hum of a passing car, the faint creak of a gate swinging in the wind. But beneath it all, the footsteps persisted, slow, steady, patient. She wanted to run, but reason held her back. "Don't be ridiculous," she told herself, almost in a whisper. "You're fine." Yet even her own voice trembled. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She quickened her pace, hoping to leave the sound behind her. But as she did, the rhythm followed suit, perfectly timed, as though it was mocking her attempt to escape. That's when panic began to seep in. Quiet but certain, her breathing grew shallow. She pulled out her phone, pretending to check something, pretending she was calm, but her fingers trembled too much to type. The screen's light reflected her face, eyes wide, lips pressed tight, trying not to look afraid. She wanted to call someone, but who would she tell? That she felt like something was following her? That she heard footsteps she couldn't see? No one believes fear until it's too late, so she kept moving. The road curved slightly, leading her past a small park. During the day, it was filled with children's laughter, but now it stood empty, the swings creaking gently as if moved by unseen hands. Her eyes darted toward them, and for just a moment she thought she saw movement, a shadow shifting behind the trees. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her chest tightened. She could feel her pulse in her throat, quick and uneven. She didn't want to run yet, but her legs itched to move faster. The silence pressed against her ears until even the smallest sound became unbearable. She tried humming a tune to fill the void, to remind herself that she was still in control, but her voice broke halfway through. The sound didn't comfort her. It only reminded her how alone she was. And then came the faintest sound, something like a sigh. Not from her, not from the wind, but from behind her. Soft, human. She froze mid-step, every muscle locking in place. She turned her head slowly, so slowly that she could feel each second stretch out like an eternity. Nothing but the quiet street and the flicker of that same lamppost behind her. But this time, she didn't believe the emptiness. The unease had now become a living thing, pulsing in the air, breathing down her neck. She started walking faster, her steps echoing louder, her breath growing harsher. She kept her eyes fixed ahead toward the faint glow that marked the turn to her street. But no matter how fast she moved, the feeling didn't fade. It grew stronger, closer. The sound of footsteps, the sigh of something unseen, the sense that eyes she couldn't meet were watching her every move. Sometimes, terror doesn't arrive with screams or shadows. It creeps in through silence. That's what she learned in that moment, because silence, when it's unnatural, tells its own story, a story of something waiting. She crossed the next intersection, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst. She didn't dare look back again. She didn't need to. Whatever was there no longer hid in the distance. It was close enough for her to feel, and though she couldn't see it, she knew who was watching. In that uneasy silence, she learned that the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see in the dark. It's what the dark can see in you. There's a certain heaviness that fills the air when you realize you're not alone. Though you can't see anyone near, it's an ancient kind of fear, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers through your bones. That was how it felt for her that night, the quiet, the stillness, the sound of her own heartbeat pulsing in her ears, as though even her body was warning her to run. But she didn't run, not yet. Fear hadn't taken over, confusion had. She kept hoping that if she just kept walking, if she ignored it long enough, it would all make sense, that there would be a logical explanation. But deep down, logic was slipping away. She could feel it before she could truly hear it. The presence that followed, the air behind her felt alive, as if it carried its own pulse, its own intent. She tried to convince herself again that she was imagining things, but imagination doesn't make the hairs on your neck rise. It doesn't make your chest tighten or your steps falter for no reason. Something was there, something that moved when she moved, paused when she paused. She could hear the rhythm of it now. Footsteps that didn't belong to her own. Slow, heavy, measured. There was something almost intelligent about the timing of it, as though it wanted her to know it was there, but not enough for her to see it. It was playing a game of distance and fear, the kind of fear that builds gradually, one breath at a time, until it feels unbearable. She dared to glance over her shoulder again, trying to catch whatever followed her in the open. But the road was bare, empty, and yet, even the emptiness didn't feel empty anymore. The shadows that stretched across the pavement seemed to move when she looked away. Every window of every house she passed looked dark, lifeless, no comfort, no witnesses, just her, and whatever was keeping pace behind. She thought of calling out, maybe just saying something aloud to break the silence, but her voice wouldn't come. It was as if fear had pressed a cold hand against her throat. So she did what she always did when she was nervous. She tried to reason with herself. "It's nothing," she whispered under her breath. "Just my mind playing tricks." But even as she said it, she knew her mind wasn't playing tricks. Her body knew better. Instinct never lies. The footsteps grew louder when she crossed the next block. It wasn't constant. It would stop when she did, start again when she moved. She began to notice how calculated it felt, not rushed, not clumsy, but deliberate, as though whatever it was knew exactly what it was doing. That was the moment when unease turned to terror. She wasn't just being followed, she was being studied. Her eyes darted from side to side, searching for someone, anyone. But there was no one. The houses that lined the street seemed abandoned, their doors shut tight, their lights off, the windows reflecting only her own fear back at her. The streetlights overhead hummed faintly, casting pale circles of light that only made the darkness between them seem deeper. Every time she stepped from one light to the next, she felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the space between was watching her. She crossed to the other side of the street, thinking maybe a change of path would help. It didn't. The sound followed, closer this time. She could hear the weight in the footsteps, the slight scuff against the concrete, the deliberate rhythm of something that wasn't human, or at least didn't move like one. She wanted to look again, to see it, to confirm what her heart already feared, but something inside told her not to. Don't look, don't give it your eyes, because once you do, it becomes real. So she walked faster, trying to appear calm, though her body was trembling. The presence behind her adjusted effortlessly, its pace matching hers, its sound growing clearer. It wasn't far now, maybe a few steps behind. She could almost feel the air shift as it moved, brushing against her back like a cold breath. Her stomach tightened and her hands grew cold. The world around her felt distorted, like everything familiar had been pulled just slightly out of place. The street, the lights, even the sound of her own heartbeat, all felt distant, like she'd stepped out of the world she knew and into something else. When she finally reached the next intersection, she thought about turning into another street, maybe one that led to a busier area, but when she looked that way, all she saw was more darkness. No lights, no sound of cars, no people, just an empty road stretching endlessly ahead, and for the first time she wondered if she'd taken the wrong turn earlier. Without realizing it, the houses didn't look familiar anymore. The road felt longer, the world quieter. Her breathing quickened, her footsteps unsteady. She could hear it clearly now, breathing, not hers, a slow, ragged inhale and exhale just behind her, faint but real. She froze. The sound stopped too. The air around her seemed to hold its breath. She didn't dare turn around. She didn't dare move. And in that unbearable stillness, a small sound broke through. The faint scrape of something dragging across the ground. Not footsteps this time. Something heavier, something closer. That was when she started to run. Not because she thought she could outrun it, but because her body no longer gave her a choice. Instinct took over. Her backpack bounced violently against her back as she sprinted down the street. The sound of her shoes slapping the pavement, mixing with the echo of whatever followed. She didn't look back, couldn't. She just ran. The cold air burned her lungs, her vision blurred, but she kept moving, driven by sheer terror. The sound behind her grew louder with every second, though she couldn't tell if it was real or if her mind had begun to unravel under fear. She turned a corner sharply, hoping to lose it, but the echo followed. She could feel it gaining ground. The street seemed endless now, stretching forward with no sign of her house, no sign of safety, just darkness waiting to swallow her whole. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a fence. Her breath came in gasps, and tears stung her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the sheer, suffocating panic of knowing something was behind her, and she couldn't see it. She could hear it again, the slow, measured steps, closer this time, almost beside her. She pressed herself against the fence, her chest heaving, her eyes wide as she tried to see through the shadows. And then, silence, the kind that isn't empty but filled with everything you don't want to know. She stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. For a moment she thought maybe it was gone. Maybe she had imagined it after all. But then, from the corner of her eyes, she saw movement, a shape, not walking, gliding, something that had no reason to belong in the world she knew. A figure without a face, darker than the night around it, moving in perfect sync with her trembling breath. That was the moment she understood. What followed her wasn't human. It wasn't alive in the way she was. It didn't walk. It watched. And it had been watching her for longer than she realized. And when she turned away and began to run again, she knew she wasn't running from something outside of her anymore. She was running from the thing that had already found its way in. There comes a point when fear no longer hides behind shadows or whispers in the silence. It steps forward. It reveals itself, not always with a face you can name, but with a presence that fills the air until you can hardly breathe. For her, that moment came when she could no longer pretend it wasn't real, when the distance between her and whatever had followed her dissolved into nothing, when the sound of her own heartbeat became the only thing she could trust, and even that began to falter. She had reached the end of the street, the one that should have led to safety, the turn that brought her home every night, but home no longer felt near. The light she had once counted on to guide her from the darkness was gone. The lamppost at the corner had flickered one last time and died, leaving her in a suffocating black that seemed to breathe. She could feel the cold pressing against her back, not like air but like intent. Something behind her stood still, yet its stillness screamed louder than any sound could. She turned her head slowly, barely daring to move. For a moment, the world tilted, caught between what she thought was real and what she feared was true. There, at the far end of the road, beneath the faint glow of a dying light, was a shape. It wasn't clear at first, just a silhouette, tall, unmoving, almost human. It stood half in shadow, half in light, as though the world couldn't decide which side it belonged to. She blinked hard, hoping it was a trick of her eyes, a distortion of fear. But when her vision cleared, it was still there, watching. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but fear has a strange way of freezing the body before it drives it to move. She stood rooted to the ground, her breath shallow, her fingers digging into the straps of her backpack. The figure didn't move. It just watched. And yet, even in its stillness, she could feel movement, an invisible pull, a quiet force drawing her closer to it. She tried to speak, to call out, maybe to ask who it was, but her voice betrayed her, coming out only as a broken whisper. The sound seemed to travel no farther than her lips before being swallowed by the night. The figure took a single step forward. Just one. But that was enough. The sound of its movement was not like a footfall. It was softer, like something dragging across the earth. That was when she ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement, her breath ragged, her body moving on pure instinct. The world around her blurred into streaks of darkness and dim light. She could hear the blood in her ears, her heart slamming against her ribs, but beneath it all she could still hear it, the sound that followed her. Not running, not rushing, but gliding, steady and relentless. Every time she thought she'd gained distance, the sound came again, closer, quieter, almost patient. She turned corners without thinking, cutting through side streets she didn't recognize. The neighborhood she had known all her life now looked foreign, twisted by shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. Street signs blurred past her, houses loomed like dark sentinels, and the wind seemed to whisper her name. Her throat burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not while it was still behind her. She stumbled once, nearly falling, her hand scraping against the rough pavement. Pain shot through her arm, grounding her for a second in something real. She pressed herself against a wall, chest heaving, her mind racing for a plan. Maybe she could hide. Maybe if she stayed still long enough it would lose interest. She slid down behind a low fence, crouching in the darkness, her shaking hands clutched tightly against her chest. For a few moments, all she could hear was her own breathing. Then, faintly, came the sound again. The soft scrape, the shifting air, the slow rhythm of something moving closer. It didn't hurry. It didn't need to. It knew exactly where she was. She could feel its presence not just around her, but inside her. Like the darkness itself had learned her name, she pressed her hand against her mouth to muffle her sobs, tears slipping down her face as she watched the street from her hiding place. and then she saw it. The figure moved past the edge of the fence, its outline clearer now. Its shape was wrong. Not broken, not monstrous, just wrong. Like a person whose edges didn't fit the world they were in. Its movements were too smooth, too slow, too deliberate. It stopped near where she had fallen earlier and tilted its head slightly, as though listening for her heartbeat. She held her breath, praying it would pass. Seconds stretched into eternities. The world grew unbearably still. And then, in one motion, the figure turned its head, directly toward where she hid. The sound that escaped her wasn't a scream. It was smaller, roar, the kind of sound that slips out when terror becomes too heavy to hold. She bolted from her hiding place and ran again. No longer thinking, no longer hoping, just moving. The sound followed, not louder, not faster, but always there, always behind her. She could see her street now, faint, distant, but real. The light from her house glowed weakly in the distance, a promise of safety she could almost touch. She pushed her body harder, ignoring the pain, the exhaustion, the trembling in her legs. She reached the final corner, her home just a few steps away, but as she turned she felt it. The air shifted, cold, still, heavy. She slowed, her body betraying her even as her mind screamed to keep running. There, standing beneath the single flickering light at the end of her driveway, was the same figure. Closer now. Its shape was clearer in the glow, and for the first time she saw its face, or what should have been one. But there were no eyes, no mouth, just emptiness where a face should have been, as though it had borrowed the form of a person but forgotten how to finish it. Her knees weakened, her body trembling uncontrollably. The light above them flickered, casting it in flashes, visible 1 second, gone the next. And each time it disappeared, she could feel it getting closer. She stumbled backward, tears streaking her cheeks, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please, stop." The light went out completely. The world was silent. Then came the sound, one soft breath, right behind her ear. That was the moment the last thread of her courage broke. She turned, but there was nothing there. Nothing she could see. Only the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding against a silence that no longer belonged to her. And in that final instant, before everything went still, she understood. The thing that followed her had never been behind her at all. It had been waiting just ahead in the darkness she kept walking toward, and once she reached it, there was nowhere left to run. By morning the world had forgotten the storm that came in the night. The sun rose, the air softened, and everything appeared as though nothing had changed. The street looked the same houses, the same sidewalks, the same tired lampposts that had watched over her every evening. But beneath that fragile calm lingered something no light could reach. The silence wasn't ordinary anymore. It was heavier, deeper, as though it carried a secret it would never tell. Her mother noticed first. The breakfast table was quiet, one seat empty. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, unbothered by absence. She told herself her daughter had probably left early, maybe for a school project, maybe for something harmless. But as minutes stretched into hours, and hours into the slow ache of waiting, that small hope began to crumble. She called the school, her voice calm at first, polite, almost embarrassed to sound worried. "She probably just forgot to tell me," she said. But when the voice on the other end answered, "She never arrived this morning," her heart fell silent. By afternoon, the neighborhood was moving in whispers. People stepped out of their homes, gathering in small groups at the corners of streets, eyes darting toward the end of the road, where she was last seen. They said her backpack was found, half open, lying near the curb just a few houses from home. Her notebook pages scattered in the wind, her phone cracked, the screen still faintly glowing as if trying to hold on to her last message. But she was gone. No sound, no struggle, no trace that told the story of what happened after she turned that final corner. The police came, their flashing lights cutting through the peaceful familiarity of the neighborhood. Yellow tape stretched across the street like a wound. Officers knocked on doors, asked the same questions over and over, wrote down the same answers that didn't lead anywhere. Did anyone see her after 8? Did you hear anything strange? Was she upset? But everyone had the same reply. No one had seen or heard a thing. As if the night had swallowed her whole and refused to give her back. For the first few days, there was movement, search parties combing the woods nearby, volunteers with flashlights calling her name into the emptiness, news cameras rolling as they spoke of another missing girl. But as days turned to weeks, that movement slowed. People stopped talking about her in the present tense. Her name became a sigh, a caution, a story told in lowered voices. Some said she must have run away. Others whispered that something darker had taken her. The truth, though, was simpler and far more chilling. She had simply vanished. Her mother refused to stop waiting. Every night she left the porch light on, the same light her daughter had followed home each evening. She sat by the window long after midnight, staring at the road, listening for footsteps that never came. The neighbors pitied her at first, then grew uneasy, because sometimes, when the night was still enough, they swore they could hear those footsteps too, the faint echo of shoes on pavement coming from nowhere and ending at her door. The street itself began to change. People avoided walking alone after dark. Children were told to take the long way around, even if it meant getting home late. The laughter that once filled those evenings was gone, replaced by a quiet dread that settled like fog. The place had lost its innocence. It was as if something had marked it, a presence left behind by what had happened there. Some said that when you walked that road alone, the air grew colder, the streetlights flickered, and the sound of footsteps would start behind you, keeping pace no matter how fast you moved. There were those who claimed to have seen her, not her exactly, but a shadow that resembled her shape, a faint outline beneath the flickering light, standing where her backpack had been found. They said she never moved, never turned her head, just stood there until you blinked, and then she was gone. But no one ever stayed long enough to look twice. Time passed, as it always does. Seasons changed, the world moved on, and yet that street never quite recovered. Houses that once felt warm began to feel hollow. Families moved away quietly, unwilling to admit they were afraid. The few who stayed learned to live with the unease, pretending not to notice when the wind carried the sound of a girl's voice calling faintly, almost tenderly, from somewhere in the dark. Her story became something whispered to children, the warning every parent spoke softly but firmly. Never walk home alone at night. And though no one could explain what had truly happened, everyone agreed on one thing. Something had taken her, not someone, but something. Something that lingered still. Years later, people who never even knew her name still avoided that road after sunset. They'd quicken their pace, glancing behind them, though they didn't know why. Some swore they'd felt eyes on them. Others said they'd heard breathing close to their ear when no one was there. One woman, new to the area, said she'd once seen a figure walking ahead of her on that street. A young girl in a school uniform, her steps light, her head slightly turned as if listening. The woman called out, thinking she might be lost, but the girl didn't turn, she just kept walking. When the woman blinked, the street was empty. The silence that followed was familiar. The same uneasy quiet that had once warned the girl before she disappeared. The same silence that had never left since. And though the world carried on, though her story faded from the headlines, and the posters peeled from the walls, the air on that road still remembers. The wind still hums her footsteps, The ground still echoes her last breath. The houses still turn cold when the sun goes down, and the lampposts flicker as though trying to hold the darkness back. It's strange how absence can haunt more deeply than presence ever could. Her disappearance left an emptiness that was not merely grief. It was a wound the world could not close, because she hadn't simply gone missing. She had been taken by something that fed on silence, on fear, on the innocence of believing we're safe just because we're home. No one knows exactly what happened that night, but sometimes, when the streets are quiet and the air is still, people say they hear it again, the faint sound of footsteps that start slow and steady, echoing softly behind them. They turn, expecting to see no one. And they don't, not at first. But if they linger too long under that flickering light, they might just catch a glimpse of her, standing at the corner, her face hidden, her eyes dark, her voice whispering the same words she never got to finish that night. Please, stop. And that's when they realize some things never really leave. There are some stories that refuse to fade, no matter how much time passes. They cling to the corners of memory, like shadows that sunlight can't erase. Hers was one of those stories, the girl who walked home alone, but never made it. Even now, her name is whispered in the same hush that people use when they talk about things not meant to be disturbed. It's strange how silence can carry a warning louder than any scream, because behind her story lies something that touches every one of us. A reminder that danger doesn't always come with a sound, and evil doesn't always wear a face. Sometimes it moves quietly beside us, disguised as the familiar. People still talk about that road. They say it feels different now, colder somehow. Even those who never knew her find themselves looking over their shoulders when they pass through it. Maybe it's just imagination. Or maybe, deep down, everyone can sense what lingers there. It isn't just the fear of what happened. It's the realization that what happened to her could happen to anyone. We go through our lives trusting the comfort of routine, thinking that bad things happen somewhere else, to someone else. But her story whispers that safety is an illusion, that evil doesn't wait for us to stray too far. It finds us in our comfort, when we least expect it, when we are sure we're safe. And yet, there's something deeply human about that. We crave safety. We want to believe in ordinary evenings, in quiet walks home, in lamplight and laughter, and the gentle rhythm of footsteps that lead us back to the people we love. But the truth her story left behind tells us to listen when something feels wrong. Because the first warning is never loud. It's a feeling, a small shift in the air, a silence that shouldn't be there, a step that echoes when it shouldn't. The world has a way of whispering to us when danger draws near. We just forget to listen. If you think about it, she did nothing wrong. She was careful, she was cautious, she was just walking home. And yet, something found her. Something that thrived in the dark, in the empty space between one heartbeat and the next. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That sometimes what claims us isn't just a person or a creature, it's fear itself. Fear feeds on silence. It waits for us to doubt what we feel, to convince ourselves that we're just imagining it, and by the time we realize the truth, it's already too close. There's a kind of irony in how her story became a warning, because warnings are often born from tragedy. People now say, never walk home alone. They tell their children, always stay where it's bright, where it's safe. But those words carry more than caution. They carry remembrance. Every time they're spoken, they breathe her name back into the world. The girl who walked home alone didn't just disappear. She became the voice that speaks through the fear of others. A voice that says, be aware, be careful, trust what you feel. There are people who still leave flowers near the corner where her backpack was found. They don't know her personally, but they feel something when they stand there, a quiet presence, a soft heaviness in the air. Some say they felt warmth on their cheek, like a hand brushing past, almost protective. Maybe it's imagination, or maybe it's her way of watching over others now. Because if her story could save even one more from walking the same path, perhaps she didn't vanish in vain. Perhaps she became the warning itself. It's easy to think of horror as something far away, as stories told to thrill us, to make our hearts race for a moment before we laugh it off. But true horror isn't in the monster or the scream. True horror lives in what's possible, in what might happen in the time it takes to blink, in what's standing just behind you when you tell yourself you're alone. Her story reminds us of that. It reminds us that evil doesn't announce itself with thunder. It slips in softly, in the spaces where we feel most at ease, and when it leaves, it takes more than a life. It takes our sense of peace, our belief that the world is kind. But even in the midst of that darkness, there's something else, something fragile but powerful, awareness. We can learn from fear. It can sharpen our instincts, heighten our senses, awaken something ancient inside us that knows how to survive. The girl's story, tragic as it is, left that behind. She taught us to pay attention, to trust the whisper that says, don't go that way, to follow the quiet voice that tells us something isn't right. It might not always make sense, but it's better to listen and be wrong than to ignore it and never come home. Sometimes when people talk about her, they lower their voices as if they might disturb her rest. But I think she doesn't mind being remembered. I think she wants her story to be told, not to frighten, but to awaken. Because if her voice still moves through the wind, if her memory still stirs the fear that keeps someone safe, then she's still here in some way, still walking beside those who listen, still reminding the world that the quietest warnings are the ones that matter most. And isn't that what every story, every loss, every shadow leaves behind? A lesson that light must be chosen, not assumed, that safety is something we create through awareness, through courage, through listening to the things we can't always explain. Maybe her story wasn't meant to end in silence. Maybe it was meant to live on in the hush of every uneasy night, in the flicker of every streetlight, in the breath you hold when you sense something you can't see. So tonight, if you find yourself walking alone, and the air feels a little colder, if you hear footsteps that don't quite match your own, don't brush it off. Don't tell yourself it's nothing. Pay attention. Turn back if you must, because the world has its mysteries, and some of them don't forgive those who ignore them. Her story lives as that reminder, that small echoing truth, that it's better to listen to fear than to become its next whisper. And though her journey ended in the dark, her warning lives in the light of every person who heard her story and chose differently. Every time someone trusts that instinct, every time someone crosses the street instead of pressing forward, she walks again, this time beside them, guiding them home safely through the night. Some say that the past never truly leaves us. I believe that, because on quiet nights, when the wind carries the faint echo of footsteps down that lonely road, it isn't just the sound of what was, it's the voice of what still is. A story that warns, that teaches, that remembers, and if you listen closely enough, you might hear it too. A whisper carried softly through the dark. Don't walk alone.